And joining us now from her home office in Chicago is Comptroller Susana Mendoza. You think it's tough working from home. Try balancing the state of Illinois' checkbook while also signing a lot of checks these days to help the state pay for and procure all of this emergency coronavirus protective gear, ventilators. Comptroller, I imagine it's been a busy few weeks for you.
It certainly has, but you know, it's always important to remember that as busy as we've been, it's nothing compared to what our frontline, COVID response folks are doing, these doctors and nurses. And I spoke with a reporter today, actually, whose father, she's a reporter out of Washington, actually in the news bureau there, that goes to these press conferences with the president. And her father is a 79-year-old doctor working on the front lines at Mercy Hospital in Chicago. 79-year-old with diabetes, with heart conditions, but nonetheless sees it as his absolute obligation to be there and to help others. And these are the stories that really just kind of like tug at your heart, and it's why everyone else is working so hard to make sure that they have the resources that they need to be able to fight this fight.
Yeah, everyday heroes are getting their due, and it's about time. A lot of them in hospitals, in grocery stores, and really just around in the supply chain, the delivery chain. A lot of people that we rely on these days are,
I think, have been taken for granted for so long, Mark. So it's really, I hope that when this is all over, that people really take the time to thank those who in the past have felt that they're invisible, and they've truly been the ones that have been keeping us going.
Before we get into, I do want to ask you some questions about how the state is managing this cash flow and this financial burden in a moment. But first, I heard the governor say at a press conference recently you couldn't be there because you were home tending to your mother. I know mom lives at home. How's mom holding up? How are you doing working through all this?
My mom is 84. She hopefully will be 85 this year in August. She has diabetes. She's had it for many years. She has high blood pressure. She's frail now at her 84 years of age, and she gets sick super easy, right? And so I had to really weigh the need for me to physically be at the press conference when I could essentially just stay home, stay healthy, continue working, make sure that she doesn't get sick, and that I'm not bringing anything into the house. And so I had that discussion with the governor. I mean, his edict, if you want to think of it that way, or his order had been very clear that we should stay home, not so much to save ourselves, but to save others. And I thought that it was important to lead by example with that.
Yeah, and thanks to technology, we're able to dial in and connect with so many of our colleagues. I'm sure your office has been doing a lot of that lately. I want to start with, first of all, there was that story, I think you were interviewed on CNN about this. There was a staff member who had to drive 3 hours with a check in hand for $3 million just to make sure that supplier didn't cancel their order. If you have any other drives like that in the future, I might volunteer to deliver that check myself, because I just like to know what a $3 million check feels like in my hand.
Well, it's a bummer when doesn't have your name on it, but
Fair.
Yeah, we did have 2 rides like that. It was the first one was by Ellen Andrus, my assistant controller, and the second one was Cortez Gillespie. Just a couple days later, both of them are controller employees. They're fantastic, and we've said from the get-go that we will do. The controller's office will do anything in our power. We will bend over backwards, think outside of the box to get the job done and to help Governor Pritzker and his agencies, make sure that our frontline providers are protected. But, not in my wildest dreams or imagination would I've ever thought that we'd be talking about one of my employees having to get in her car, drive 126 miles, breaking every speed limit, and having to pass off or hand off a $3+ million check to a vendor that we've never met in order to make sure that we could procure 1.5 million masks. I mean, I've kind of made the analogy that it seems like it's like you're doing a sketchy drug deal, which of course none of us have done, but I'm just saying that that's the sentiment of how unusual this is. And that literally if you don't get there by a certain time and hand off that check, we're gonna miss out on that deal to another state or another country. And so it's taken that type of we're not gonna take no for an answer. When we first heard about it, we thought, well, we're going to lose that deal because this vendor has now told us that if he doesn't get the money by 2 p.m. in his bank account, we'll lose the deal. And so in a normal world, you think the deal's done, but we didn't let the deal fall through, and Ellen Andrus got the job done for us, and Cortez did a couple days later.
I can't think of a more poignant example that illustrates just the leverage that these suppliers have on states right now. When you consider the mad dash on these supplies, when a supplier can say, hey, sorry, if you don't get here by 2, we're taking it somewhere else, they're using that same leverage to jack up the cost of all this too. You've been in the past a voice of fiscal conservatism in a way to say like, hey, if this spending is too much or if someone's taking advantage of the state, you'd step in to criticize that. I know that there's an immediate priority to get all the shipment we need now, all the gear we need now, and then go about the business of saving lives. But in that process, is there time for you to stop and say, wait a minute, we might be getting screwed over a bit here?
We have been, actually, and that's, these are all the behind the scenes actions that are taking place. And in the very first few days, you really have to just meet the challenge and, trust that the initial vetting that had been done of these vendors within a day or two of getting the lead on the masks or on the respirators was done correctly. Since then, we have, of course, raised that alarm and said, hey, I don't feel comfortable writing a $20 million check or a $10 million check unless if we have some assurances that as thorough of a possible vetting, even though it has to happen super fast. We don't have 3 to 6 months like we normally would in a procurement, right? These are leads that we say, your uncle has a friend who has a friend and we can get 1 million masks, but we need the money tomorrow or the next day. It's hard to really properly vet that, but we have we've been working closely with IEMA and their procurement team to make sure that our concerns have been met, or are being taken into account. We've consulted with the Illinois State Police and even consulted with the FBI as to best practices for vetting in very short periods of time. And they've assisted with certain vettings that we've asked for. So, and that IEMA is, of course, doing the very best that they can under almost impossible circumstances.
You mentioned about every state agency there. Yeah, I didn't mean to cut you off. You mentioned about every state agency there except for the Illinois Attorney General. His office has issued press releases saying, don't price gouge, don't exploit this disaster. Does he have any leverage there to step in and enforce or to wield a threat from the legal side and say, you can't take advantage of the state here? Or is this just markets running free?
Look, at the end of the day, I think he's doing what he needs to do. We would hope every attorney general would be saying it's not okay to price gouge. But literally, when you almost feel like you have a gun to your head and that if you don't do the right thing, you're going to lose, right? You don't have a ton of leverage in these cases. And I think when this is all over, the attorney generals should come together and they should probably really go after companies that they know could have just been much better players in the mix and absolutely crack down on anybody who actually did fraudulent deals. But in the
At this time, can you name any of those companies? Do you suspect any of those companies?
I can't name anybody right now. But again, we're like literally every minute of the day, besides when I'm doing an interview like this, dealing on a hands-on situation. My team right now is working with IEMA to make sure that any other additional needs get fulfilled. But it's when this is over, I'm sure that not just Illinois, but every single state in the country is going to have to look at what happened and where things went really well and where things went bad. And hopefully the attorney generals will band together and put some real pressure on any bad players and never let them do business again, period, right? But in the meantime, I feel pretty good that Illinois, as far as we know, has not fallen victim to any scam that we know of, or especially any major scam, and we are moving ahead. The bigger issue for us, of course, I think we have a good handle on how we're trying to win as many of these PPE orders as possible. The bigger issue is, of course, the finances and the ramifications of what this coronavirus will do to our financial picture. But
yeah, and you've actually posted a big website, or up on your website, a running ledger of the balance sheet of all this cost. And at last report, it was about $170 million of expenses, give or take.
Updated every day, so people should go to it's our transparency portal for COVID-related response.
And on there you'll see purchases of PPE, those gloves and masks, but also ventilators, flights, just a lot of different expenses that are coming through right now, popping up there. What does, to get that coronavirus code on the expense for the state, what does it have to, the reason I ask this question is because we've spent $170 million so far. That number will continue to rise, but Congress just cut a check to the state of Illinois for about $2.7 billion. We'd have to go through this a lot longer before we'd ever spend all of that money up. So what gives? I mean, shouldn't we be flush with cash right now to go out and buy all these items because of that money from Congress?
Well, before I answer that, let me just say one last thing on the PPE side of seeing the prices that we've been paying for these products are so ridiculously over the top, right? When you're paying 7 to 8 times what you normally would for a glove or for a mask, Or for ventilators, when you get into ventilators, you're really getting fleeced. I mean, a ventilator that costs $12,000 is going on the market right now for $65,000, right? Now multiply that by 4,000 ventilators or however many you need. It's an outrageous amount of money, and many states can't afford it. I've been very critical, as has this governor, Governor Pritzker, of the federal administration of President Trump in particular, because he did not exercise the really strong power of getting the Federal Production Act into play, full steam, not just like one instance here or one instance there, but essentially putting American companies to work with Americans, helping our country get through this, and keeping the prices of these ventilators, of these PPEs, down as low as possible and supplying them in a much quicker way to the states that need them. Instead, this is why we've had to resort to a black market type of an environment where it literally is the wild, wild west, where these things are, it's the brother of a cousin, you know, who's coming up with this deal. I mean, it's so ridiculous. And we had hoped early on that if this Federal Production Act would have been going during February and March, by the time we got into April and New York is peaking and Illinois is going through what we're going through in Louisiana and New Jersey and California, we would have been able to get sourced with all of these products from our companies right here, and we'd be paying a fraction of the cost. So there is a massive cost to taxpayers as a result of that failure, and it's unfortunate. Now, when you talk about, to answer your other question, the money that we're getting from the federal government, which of course we're super excited to get because we absolutely need it, this is going to throw a significant hole in our budget, the COVID-19 epidemic or pandemic, because people are out of work. So it's not just the money that we're spending on the COVID-19 related products like the PPE, it's the fact that essentially across the country, 10% of the people are no longer working as a result of this. That means less revenues coming into the state. And the problem that we see, at least from my perspective, with the federal funds that we're receiving is that we're very limited as to how we can spend them. So we were promised essentially around $3 billion, a little more than that hopefully. But so far there's been a lot of restrictions and we can only use it on COVID related things. And you know, it doesn't account for the fact that because people aren't working, our revenues are taking a dramatic hit. And my office is potentially going to have a bunch of federal dollars that we can't use to actually pay bills that we need to pay. And that's not as helpful as we'd like.
We've seen signals, though, from Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and from House Speaker Nancy Pelosi that another version of the CARES Act could be forthcoming at some point. And we've seen Governor Pritzker and other governors call for that money to be allowed to fill in some of those budget holes. But right now, where it stands, there's about $2.7 billion from the feds, and they say you can only spend it on coronavirus-related expenses. And right now, the coronavirus-related expenses have only totaled about $170 million. So is it the hope that some of that extra money can be used to come fill in all that lost income tax, sales tax, corporate income tax?
That's what has to happen, Mark. Otherwise, we're essentially going to have a huge COVID-19 related fund that doesn't account for what the ramifications of this pandemic actually caused, right? The products that we're purchasing itself, even though it's a lot of money that wasn't in our original budget, it's a drop in the bucket compared to what the aftershock of COVID-19 caused to each state. You know, 10% loss in employment, significantly huge hole in our revenues. Every month that we used to, you've been covering the budget for how many years now? And we always knew that April was our best month. Right now, April's a horrendous month for us because our sales taxes, which normally we see this influx of money come in April, we're not even going to see any of that until July since we delayed the tax season. And then normal months for us, like let's say May is usually a good month for us. It's going to be a terrible month for us, maybe as bad as February is for us, which is always the worst month of the year. So we are no longer, this whole next, not just fiscal, but calendar year, are going to have months that we could predict are going to be good months for us. Right now, the best month that we're going to have is probably going to be what the worst good month was for us in the past, right? So this is an entirely new, uncharted territory, not just for Illinois, but for every state. And the more restrictions are placed on these dollars that are set from the federal government, the less effective states are going to be able to plug in those huge holes. Remember, we still have an $8 billion bill backlog to contend with.
I was just going to say, I think I think that offers a bit of perspective. If you look at the entire bill backlog, it's about $8 billion. If you look at the Governor's Office of Management and Budget, as they have surveyed the devastation here, they've said over the next year or two, the hit to the budget could be $10 billion, more than doubling the size of that backlog. So this is no small thing.
No, this is no joke. It's really a world of hurt. I would say the only silver lining in this for Illinoisans is that your comptroller here has had nothing but experience dealing with fiscal crisis, right? I mean, I got elected in the middle of the worst fiscal crisis our state's ever been through, and we were well on our way of getting out of that. I'm very proud of the job we did. We cut the bill backlog by more than half. And I'm much more seasoned even now and prepared for any type of fiscal challenge that comes our way. Other controllers across the country didn't have that kind of like really massive learning curve, or I should say learning opportunity with dealing with crisis. They were all living through the best bull market in the history of their lifetimes. Illinois had a massively self-inflicted wound that allowed me no room for breathing. I just had to fully figure out how to get us through that crisis. So this is another fiscal crisis. No matter how bad it is, we're going to get through it in Illinois. I'm truly more concerned and like heartbroken by the human toll that happened through this crisis. I mean, you think about the fact that we're ordering body bags, right? What does that mean? It's not a plastic bag, or it's a bag that will carry someone's loved one, the most treasured person in someone's life. And that's what this coronavirus is doing to Illinois. So we'll get through the fiscal stuff, and I'm sure of that. And it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard, the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, and that our employees will ever do in their lives, running this office. But we'll get through it. I just hope that people can get through the more painful stuff, right? Which is the human toll that this virus is taking in our state.
Yeah, we can see that some of that perhaps wearing on you a bit. It's certainly a lot to consider and to take in. There have been some politicians on the national scene discussing that delicate balance, or trying to weigh the cost benefit of, quote, reopening the economy or letting kids go back to schools. I think even Dr. Oz was on Fox News recently and suggested that 2 to 3% mortality rate is something maybe some Americans could live with. What do you hear? What do you think when you hear rationale like that?
I think Governor Pritzker has been very clear, and I share his same sentiment, and I'm thankful that he thinks this way, that we're going to fight for every single Illinoisan and their lives. And we hope that people realize that, this virus doesn't care if you're a Democrat or a Republican. It doesn't care if you feel like going outside and partying with your friends. It doesn't care if you're bored at home. It just wants to get in your body and kill you. That's essentially what it wants to do. So, sometimes it doesn't matter, you lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. It's frustrating to know that the solution to this is having to stay home. Because yes, people want to get back to work. I get that. But I think those same people right now might be feeling, I need to get back to work, and that's the most important thing. But if their wife or their kid or their parent died as a result of a rush to work when we weren't ready yet, they're going to have to live with that for the rest of their lives. I think when people think of a number in abstract, and Dr. Oz talks about a 2.4%, he's not thinking about that as that number being a real person and being essentially millions of people potentially, or hundreds of thousands who are going to die. So, if Dr. Oz wants to do that and he ends up being one of that 2.4%, I wouldn't feel as bad. But if it's somebody who wants to live, who gets infected because somebody else was being irresponsible, then I do have a problem with that. So our doctors should be talking about science, and they should have some empathy in the fact that a number is not just a number on a spreadsheet. As I've said before about the financial picture and the backlog, those numbers represent real people. And yeah. I think we have an obligation as government officials to try to protect as many people as possible.
And then one last question before we let you go, because you mentioned the human toll, the empathy. There's a lot of business owners right now that, to no fault of their own, are very legitimately concerned that they might not be able to reopen their doors. They may permanently close down. They're hoping that doesn't happen. And of course, God forbid that happens on a wide scale or really at all. But given the fact that this is the year that voters will decide in November whether or not to raise taxes on the wealthy, people who make more than $250,000 a year, Governor Pritzker has said, we need the progressive income tax now more than ever. But some Republicans have said raising taxes at a time like this on job creators, on business owners, would only deepen the recession and accelerate job losses. What do you say? Is the progressive income tax more necessary or more difficult to pass now?
I think it's more necessary. It's more than ever. And look, the working class, the lower class, and the middle class have been devastated by the coronavirus. The people that are surviving this are the folks who have deep enough pockets to get through it. And honestly, if you want to be able to tackle this COVID virus as best as possible, then the federal government, this is where they should step up and say, we understand that small businesses are hurting, and we're going to provide the funds necessary to keep them open longer. Essentially, you're paying people to stay home. Right now, that's not essentially happening. A $1,200 check with the president's name on it, guess what? That's not keeping people long-term in a situation where they're going to be incentivized to stay home. That barely is going to allow people to pay some of their rents. Maybe it's going to go towards some groceries for a short period of time. We need to do much more than that. We need to acknowledge that small businesses need additional help, and maybe not even just in loans, but in grants, right? You're bringing your people back to work, you get greater incentives. There's different things that the government can do than just do a knee-jerk reaction that doesn't really help anybody but might get them a press pop. And so I think now is the time for real critical thinking and real leadership. And so, we'll see what happens. I haven't been too inspired so far from what I've seen at the federal level. But I do know that, for example, the money that we've been given, which we desperately need, needs to have less strings attached to it, because I should be able to pay Medicaid-related bills that have gone unpaid through this pandemic. I should be able to pay for the work of the people that are not working right now, have some sort of programs that assist those folks, whether it's food or whatever it is. We should be able to pay those bills, which right now are just racking up. So the fact that we are going to see a potential $7.4 billion hole if we don't pass the progressive income tax, it's still not like a solve all problems thing. Remember, even if we do pass it, we're looking at I think a $6.2 billion bill hole, I should say, on top of our bill backlog. So we do need it. The folks who are in those very, very super wealthy groups are the ones who would be shouldering the cost of this tax. I think the people who are unemployed right now, or the people who are the essential workers, are the ones who should least have to be burdened with paying more taxes, and that's what the progressive income tax plan does. It says that anyone who's in the 97% of the population, which covers every single person that I just mentioned who's not super uber wealthy, would see their taxes frozen or cut. That's exactly what we need. And we need to ask the people who have just outrageous amounts of money who earned it. I'm not saying they didn't, but right now is when our country needs you more than ever. And we're asking, I would certainly say, I want to ask them to step up and not complain about doing their part to help our state get back on track. This was not a self-inflicted wound like wounds of the past. This is a wound that every state in the country is going to have. And right now, those who can most afford to help, they should want to step up. They shouldn't have to be forced to do so. And I think the progressive income tax will right a wrong that has existed for many years in how we tax people. The people who can least afford it have been the ones who've been carrying the burden of taxes more for many years, and now it's time that those who can most afford it, do it.
All right, Comptroller Mendoza, yeah, you said not a self-inflicted wound, but certainly one just as deep, if not deeper, as any we've seen in recent history. Again, you mentioned that $7+ billion figure. That's about a little more than a sixth of the entire state budget just evaporated, gone, and that's made worse without the progressive income tax in that budget deficit number in 1 year alone, right? And of course,
how about not even in a year, in a couple months? It's just, it's unprecedented.
The ripple effect is staggering. So you think you want to be an elected official? Good luck figuring out the road to recovery from there. But
look, right now is when it's best to be an elected official, right? I don't like to do it when it's easy. Of course, I think I would love to look forward to the days where we don't have these problems, but I know that I want to be a part of fixing them, and that's why I'm glad to be where I'm at right now, and I'm glad that this burden will be on me and my team, and we'll figure it out. All right,
well, Comptroller Mendoza, thank you for joining us from your home office, Comptroller Office West, I believe, Portage Park there. Thanks for joining us. Northwest, you get a little lost, and when it's Springfield, you're all north to us, I guess, in that case.
I want to be clear that while I live in the northwest side of the city of Chicago, I love central and southern Illinois. I love my whole state. So kisses to everybody, and please stay safe and take care of others, okay?
All right, we look forward to having you back downstate before too long. Hopefully this scourge is lifted, the cloud of it and all that. And we're back with House Republican leader Jim Durkin next. Stick around.